6 months after my parents burned my college applications. We all sat around the dining room table at exactly 3 p.m. for what my father called a family meeting. He sounded as confident as ever. Richard Mercer had always believed that if he spoke first and loudly enough, everyone else would eventually agree. Then Arthur Bennett walked in, carrying a thick manila folder. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush. He simply placed the folder in the center of the table. Across the tab, in neat black lettering, were 2 words and a label I couldn't stop looking at. Exhibit B. My father reached for it automatically, but Arthur rested 2 fingers on the cover before he could touch it. "Not yet," he said, for the first time I could remember. My father stopped talking in the middle of a sentence. My mother stared at the tablecloth, as though the pattern suddenly required her full attention. Noah shifted uneasily in his chair, without saying a word. The room felt strangely small, crowded not with people, but with things nobody had wanted to acknowledge for the last 6 months. I remember thinking that none of them were looking at me. They were looking at that folder. It was an odd feeling, watching silence do what years of arguments never had. Whenever people asked why I hadn't gone away to college after graduation, I usually smiled and gave them a version that made everyone comfortable. I said my plans had changed. I said I was taking time to figure things out. People accepted simple answers because they preferred them. The truth smelled like smoke. I could still picture 47 pages scattered across our backyard patio, their edges curling into black flakes, while tiny pieces of my handwriting disappeared into the air. Recommendation letters, personal essays, application forms I'd spent 2 years perfecting. They didn't vanish all at once. Paper burns slowly enough that you have time to recognize every page before it's gone. I watched every one of them. Back then, I believed my future had disappeared into that fire. I didn't realize someone else had already written a very different ending. I had spent 2 years building a future that fit neatly inside a set of folders and passwords. Every class I chose, every weekend volunteer shift, every late night at the kitchen table pointed toward the same goal. I wanted to study civil engineering. Bridges fascinated me because they solved problems quietly. If they were designed well, nobody noticed them. They simply carried people where they needed to go. By the start of senior year, my transcript showed a 3.94 gigapascals. My SAT score came back as 1,510. I had applications ready for 3 universities, each one accompanied by recommendation letters and essays that had gone through more revisions than I could count. The application fees alone totaled $75, money I'd earned shelving books at the public library after school. Around that same time, our house slowly stopped revolving around me. Everything became about Noah. He was 16 and talented enough at baseball that my father believed every showcase was the one that would change our lives. Weekend tournaments replaced family dinners. Hotel reservations replaced conversations about college. If equipment needed replacing or travel costs came due, the money always appeared somehow. When I mentioned financial aid deadlines, my father would nod without really listening. "We'll figure it out," he always said. We never did. Mrs. Elaine Foster, my guidance counselor, noticed before anyone else. During one meeting, she flipped through my file, looked at me over her glasses, and frowned. "You've done all this work?" she said quietly. "Tell me you've made copies of everything." I told her I had digital versions, though I wasn't as organized as I should have been. She nodded, but her expression didn't soften. That afternoon, I came home carrying the last acceptance packet I planned to mail. When I walked into the kitchen, my father was standing by the counter, holding the large envelope I'd hidden behind the cereal boxes. The envelope looked small in my father's hands. He turned it over once, reading the university's address, without saying anything. My mother stood at the sink, drying a coffee mug that was already dry. Noah leaned against the refrigerator, still wearing his baseball jacket from practice. "I thought we settled this," my father finally said. I told him we hadn't settled anything. The deadlines hadn't passed, and I had paid every application fee myself. All I needed was for him to stop standing between me and the mailbox. He shook his head, as though I was missing something obvious. "We can't afford to chase 2 dreams," he said. "Noah has a real shot." I answered quietly that my future wasn't competing with Noah's. He walked outside without another word. I followed him to the backyard, where the old burn barrel sat near the fence. Before I understood what he intended, he dropped the envelope inside. 1 match, One flick of his wrist. The paper caught faster than I expected. I remember every minute of those next 11. I asked him to stop only once. Yelling wouldn't have changed his mind. And I knew it. My mother stood on the patio, arms folded tightly across her chest. She never told him to put the papers out. Noah looked away after a few seconds, saying nothing at all. The flames climbed through recommendation letters, transcripts, essays, and forms I'd spent months polishing. When the fire finally died down, I took out my phone. I photographed the ashes from every angle, 18 pictures in all. My father laughed softly and asked what good photographs of ashes would ever do. I didn't answer. That afternoon, I drove to see my grandmother, Margaret Holloway. I expected sympathy. Instead, after listening without interrupting, she asked only one question. "Did you keep anything?" I told Grandma the truth. "Not the papers," I said, "but I kept what I could." I showed her my phone. The 18 photographs were still there, each stamped with the time they had been taken. I explained that most of my applications had been submitted online before I printed them. The essays were saved on my laptop. My recommendation letters had been emailed to me as backups, somewhere on an external hard drive. I had copies of nearly everything. She studied the screen for a long moment without saying a word. Then she nodded once. "Good," she said. "Never throw away proof." It wasn't the response I expected. She didn't criticize my parents or tell me life was unfair. She simply seemed relieved, as though I'd answered a question she'd been carrying for years. The next Monday, I met with Mrs. Elaine Foster. Together, we rebuilt what we could. She helped me recover confirmation emails, download duplicate documents, and organize everything into folders that actually made sense. By the end of the afternoon, I had 31 saved emails and digital copies of nearly every document that had gone into the fire. It didn't restore my plans, but it proved they had existed. That evening, I copied everything onto a small external hard drive and slid it into my desk drawer. 9 days passed. I worked extra hours at the library, avoided conversations at home, and let an unfamiliar phone number ring without answering. The caller left a voicemail. I assumed it was another college office, reminding me about deadlines I could no longer meet. On the 10th evening, I finally pressed play. The message lasted just 23 seconds. "My name is Arthur Bennett," the calm voice said. "I represent your grandmother, Margaret Holloway. I'd appreciate the opportunity to speak with you at your earliest convenience." I listened to it twice. Then, a third time. The voicemail was only 23 seconds long. I wouldn't listen to it for another 9 days. I called Arthur Bennett the next morning from the parking lot outside the library before my shift started. He answered on the second ring. "Mr. Mercer," he said, as though he'd been expecting me. "Thank you for calling." His voice was measured, the kind that never hurried itself. He confirmed that he represented my grandmother, Margaret Holloway, then asked if I was somewhere I could speak privately. For the next 17 minutes, he explained just enough to leave me with more questions than answers. 14 years earlier, my grandmother had established an education trust for her grandchildren. Arthur emphasized that it was independent, carefully structured, and administered through his office. He also made one thing very clear. "This isn't something your parents manage," he said. I leaned against my car, trying to understand why Grandma had never mentioned any of this. "I don't understand," I admitted. "You aren't expected to," he replied. "Not yet." He never discussed dollar amounts. He never described the terms. When I asked whether this meant I could still go to college, he paused before answering. "There are conditions," he said, "and there are procedures." A few weeks later, Grandma passed away peacefully in her sleep. The funeral was quiet, exactly as she would have wanted. My parents spoke often about settling her affairs, assuming anything she left behind would be divided the way families usually expected. My father even remarked that whatever remained should benefit the whole family. Arthur never corrected him. Not there. After the service, he handed me a business card and said he would contact everyone when the appropriate time came. As I slipped the card into my wallet, he looked directly at me. "Your grandmother expected resistance," he said. Those 5 words stayed with me long after we shook hands. The family meeting began exactly 1 week after Grandma's funeral. Arthur Bennett waited until everyone was seated before opening the manila folder. It was thicker than I'd realized. He removed one document at a time, arranging them carefully across the table, as though he were building something that couldn't be rushed. My father folded his arms. "I don't see why this needs to be so formal," he said. Arthur didn't respond immediately. Instead, he slid the first photograph across the table. It was one of the 18 pictures I'd taken of the burn barrel. Then came printed email confirmations showing when my college applications had been submitted. Timestamps, dates, file names. Mrs. Elaine Foster's signed statement describing our meetings after the applications were destroyed. Every page fit neatly behind the one before it. "There are 4 witnesses whose statements are included," Arthur said evenly. "Relevant portions have been notarized where appropriate." No one interrupted him. My father finally cleared his throat. "I was his parent," he said. "Those decisions were mine to make." Arthur inclined his head slightly, as though acknowledging the sentence without agreeing with it. "The trust instrument does not question your authority as a parent," he replied. "It addresses something else entirely." He opened a bound document. 63 pages, signed in 2012. 3 notarized amendments attached behind it. "My client anticipated the possibility," he continued, "that a grandchild's educational opportunities could be intentionally obstructed. She included a protective clause to address that circumstance." The room went perfectly still. My mother looked at the photographs again, but this time, she wasn't looking at ashes. She was looking at evidence. For the first time in my life, my father realized this wasn't an argument he controlled. Arthur let the silence settle before turning to the final section of the trust. "My responsibility," he said, "is to carry out Margaret Holloway's instructions exactly as they were written." He read the clause slowly enough that no one could misunderstand it. If a grandchild's education was deliberately obstructed by a parent or guardian, and that obstruction could be documented, control of that grandchild's educational trust would transfer directly to the beneficiary. No parent could redirect it, borrow against it, or influence how it was used. He closed the document. "The conditions have been met." No one spoke. Arthur placed a second folder in front of me. "This trust covers tuition, required fees, housing, and reasonable living expenses for 4 academic years," he said. "Mr. Mercer, you alone control these funds." My father finally found his voice. "That's impossible." "It is not," Arthur replied calmly. "The trust is irrevocable." There was no argument after that, because there wasn't one left to make. The decision had been signed years before any of us sat around that table. Noah stared at the wood grain beneath his hands. "I never asked for this," he said quietly. It was the first time he'd acknowledged that my future had been treated like something negotiable. I nodded once. There wasn't anything useful to add. Arthur handed me one last item, a handwritten letter from Grandma. I didn't open it immediately. The estate review lasted 54 minutes. When it ended, my parents walked out together without another word. No one had been mocked. No one had been shamed. The truth had simply arrived, and it stayed where it belonged. When everyone finally stopped talking, there was only one photograph left on the table. My first semester began in August. Walking across campus that first morning felt quieter than I'd imagined it would. There wasn't a dramatic sense of triumph. Mostly, there was relief. For the first time in months, my energy went toward classes instead of defending decisions I'd already made. The trust covered exactly what Arthur had promised. Tuition was paid directly. Housing was arranged. I found a part-time campus job anyway because I wanted to earn my own spending money. Grandma had protected my education, not my work ethic. Things at home settled into something that wasn't quite reconciliation, but wasn't open conflict either. My parents called occasionally. Our conversations stayed polite and short. We avoided pretending the past hadn't happened, but we also stopped trying to rewrite it. Noah found a job at a sporting goods store, while continuing baseball at a level our family could realistically afford. One evening, he apologized not for the fire itself, because it hadn't been his decision, but for standing there in silence. I told him that sometimes silence costs more than people expect. That was enough. A few weeks into the semester, I drove to the park where Grandma liked to spend Saturday mornings. Bench number 12 overlooked a small pond that caught the sunrise just after 6:40 a.m. I carried 2 things with me: the printed acceptance email from the university I was now attending, and one unopened envelope. Inside it was Grandma's handwritten letter. I still wasn't ready to read it. Some gifts don't need to be opened immediately to change your life. The paper in my hands wasn't the one they'd burned. It was the copy I'd earned twice once through hard work. and once because one person believed the truth deserved protection.